All right. Hello, everyone. Hi. Thanks for joining in. We'll wait a couple seconds, give people an opportunity to join us. In the meantime, where is everyone tuning in from? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for joining us. We'll see a couple people are joining us. We'll probably wait just a couple seconds, a couple minutes to give more folks an opportunity to tune in, but thank you all so much. We have lots of fun things to talk about today. All right. Let's see if people are letting us know where they're tuning in from. All right, let's go ahead and get started then. Thank you all. I see someone tuning in from St. Paul. Thank you for being here virtually, joining us. I'll go ahead and just get started and let people let us know as we start our little introduction here. But hello, everyone. My name is Aurora Perez. I work with Latino Outdoors in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm really excited to see you all joining us today. I see a couple people joining in from the East Bay in the Bay Area, the Northern Pomo Ancestral Lands in Fort Bragg. Thank you all so much. This is why we love virtual presentations, because we can all come together from so many different places. We're going to be talking about today in partnership with the Xerces Society to talk about pollinator conservation, learn a little bit of the science behind that, learn a little bit about stewardship and some of the things that all sorts of organizations are doing to take action in some of that pollinator conservation. So we have lots of fun stuff planned for you all. You won't actually see me presenting too much. I'll be more in the behind the scenes, but we have these wonderful panelists that will get us going and get us started today. So how about we do a little round of introductions and then just kind of jump into our presentation. Isis, you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Isis Howard. I'm an endangered species conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. And I have the pleasure of working with monarch butterflies full time. And my work focuses on community science. So we'll get into that a little bit later today. But primarily, I work to connect and engage everyday people from any background, from any experience level, and engage them with scientific research that helps support and protect monarchs and other butterflies and Aris pollinators too. So with that, I guess I'll pass it to my colleague Deedee, who's also on this call.
Hey everybody, my name is Deedee Soto. I'm a pollinator conservation planner and NRCS partner biologist with the Xerces Society. And similarly to Isis, I get to work with monarchs and pollinators, but I work more on the working land side of things and typically work with farmers and ranchers managing their lands and implementing conservation practices to help pollinators. And then on the side, I do a little bit of everything for pollinators and do outreach and talks and all sorts of things to engage folks in the work that we do. And with that, I'll pass it to Daniel.
Thank you, Deedee. Yeah, so my name is Daniel Correa, and I'm one of the outdoor leaders for Latino Outdoors in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I work with Aurora various projects such as hikes, camping, backpacking, very great activities for the communities around the Bay Area. And even right now, I'm a volunteer with Latino Outdoors, but for my full-time job, I do a lot of wetland restoration, So I do vegetation management. I collect data in the field. My work takes place mostly in the Delta area of the East Bay, but I also do a lot of community work that you'll get to see in my presentation later today.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your introductions. Really excited to have you all out here. And for everyone that's watching us, this is just the first part of our pollinator conservation series. We have this virtual presentation for you all, and then we have an in-person outing event this Saturday and the 12th of November, and another one up in the East Bay area on the 20th of November on a Sunday. And there's still plenty of spots to register. So if you're interested, please visit our website at latino.outdoors.org to see the registration links and sign up for some of those events that we have going on. But yeah,
I want to say it's really exciting because we're working with East Bay Regional Parks District. And so we're going to be visiting Ardenwood and Point Pinole. So if you haven't been out to those places yet, we'll get to explore those in the context of monarchs and pollinators, and we'll have some learning activities and some walking around and enjoying the open space, and some hands-on opportunities. All ages welcome. So please, do check out our events at latino.outdoors.org, and we hope to see you there.
Yeah, thank you. And, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, we do have designated Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to drop in your questions or comments as they come throughout the presentation, and then we'll try to pick some of those out for the end. But yeah, thank you all again so much for tuning in, and I'll leave it all to our panelists to kind of get our presentation going.
All right, well, with that, I'll get us started. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Bienvenidos todos. It's a pleasure to be presenting to you all. And we just wanted to do a little presentation or talk to give you a bit of background on monarchs and pollinators. And so I'll start off. Isis, can you go to the next slide, please? I'll start off with an introduction to monarchs and pollinators and who the Xerces Society is. And then Isis will take over and tell us a little bit more of how we can take action and help monarchs and pollinators in our communities. And then Daniel will be presenting on examples of local restoration and stewardship efforts that he's worked on. And then we'll follow up with a question and answer section where you guys can ask any questions, and feel free to drop comments or questions into the chat, and we'll answer those at the end. So I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to the Xerces Society, who we are, and a little bit of an introduction to invertebrates and pollinators as well. So if you're not familiar with the Xerces Society, we're a nonprofit that's dedicated to invertebrate conservation. And our motto is protecting the life that sustains us. So we've been around since 1971, and we were first started by Robert Michael Pyle, and he was really loved butterflies and was studying butterflies. And there was this example of there's a Xerces butterfly. It's called a Xerces blue butterfly, which was the first documented butterfly species to go extinct due to human activities. And this was actually in the Bay Area here in California. And so this went extinct around the 1950s, and that was all due to urbanization and the destruction of its habitat. So the coastal dunes of San Francisco were its original habitat, and these areas were developed and turned into businesses and homes and all sorts of things. And so essentially these butterflies lost their habitat and went extinct. And so Robert was kind of motivated by this, or to start something that really protected these animals. And invertebrates are really small sometimes, they're not like large mammals. They're, they're harder to see and harder to get to know. And so a lot of times they're overlooked. And so he wanted to make sure that these creatures weren't overlooked and were protected for the future, because they really are important to all of us. Next slide, please. So what exactly does the Xerces Society do? So we have a couple of different major programs. I'm part of the Pollinator program, and so we focus a lot on pollinator conservation, and particularly with a lens through agricultural biodiversity and working lands. But we do have other major programs like the Endangered Species Program, which ICES is a part of. We also have a pesticides team that looks into pesticides and their effects on pollinators and invertebrates. We also have community outreach and community programs for community science. And we do a lot of conservation planning and restoration and education and research, and a lot of advocacy in terms of pollinators and invertebrates to protect both the animals and their habitat. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we do have some really great community science programs, and luckily we have ICES here to tell us a little bit more about it in more detail a little bit later on. But we do have programs like Bumblebee Watch, Western Monarch Count, Pond Watch, Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, and we also do some freshwater mussel surveys and relocation. And a lot of times these programs are open to the community, and you can participate and help with some of this research and provide some information for the science that we're doing to help promote the well-being of all of these creatures. Next slide. So why are invertebrates so important? And there's this quote that the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. And that's really, it resounds a lot with me. And I'm sure that, once you get to know these things better, you understand why that's such a factual and important quote. So invertebrates provide a lot of ecosystem services. They provide decomposition services for detritus and just a lot of waste and things that, if we didn't have these creatures, we might be buried under a lot of environmental waste and whatnot. They also provide biocontrol. So there's a lot of insects that are pests in certain situations, or that can produce really rapidly. And there's insects to control some of those other insects or things that can reproduce really quickly and sometimes can cause problems. And we see this more in terms of like agriculture. They provide a lot of good biocontrol for the pest species that end up in agricultural production. They're also the base of the food chain, so they provide a lot of, they're a great food source for a lot of wildlife, from things like fish all the way up to grizzly bears. And surprisingly, insects have a lot of protein and they're very nutritious. And one of the most important things is pollination. So they provide great pollination services, which helps our plant diversity persist, and also helps with genetic diversity. Although a lot of plants are self-fertile, a lot of them benefit or require cross-pollination, and insects play a huge role in that. Next slide. So more than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, and mostly insects, to move pollen. And a diverse pollinator community is essential for sustaining natural areas and productive agricultural lands. So a lot of the plant species, as I mentioned, require an animal or some sort of mechanism to move pollen from one plant to another in order to provide genetic diversity and cross-pollination. So a lot of our insects and invertebrates provide these critical services for a lot of the plants, and that promotes genetic diversity of flowering plants, which is really important. We have a lot of many different species of flowering plants all over the world, but we're lucky here in California that California is actually the most diverse state in terms of flora. So in terms of plants, we actually have the highest number of diversity out of any of the U.S. other states in the U.S. So we also have a great diversity of pollinators here in the state of California too. Next slide. And pollinators also serve as ecological keystones. So not only are plants reliant on pollinators for that genetic diversity, but they also are the base of food web for many animals. And if we were to remove pollinators, we would see huge impacts to many different things, including the diversity of plants and diversity of animals, and the abundance of these things if they were to be removed from the ecosystems. Next slide. And so just to give you a little bit of a pollination 101, so cross-pollination is when you move pollen from one plant to another plant, and they're both the same species. And so you move the pollen grains from the anthers of one flower onto the stigma of another flower, and that provides cross-pollination. And many times it's usually an insect that's providing these services, although insects aren't the only ones that provide pollination services. We do have both vertebrate and invertebrate pollinators, and then there's some instances where flowers are also pollinated by non-biotic factors like wind or water. Next slide. So pollinators are in decline, according to a intergovernmental science policy platform study. 40% of invertebrate pollinator species may be at risk of extinction in the coming years. Next slide. And similarly, according to World Wildlife Fund for Nature, there has been a 52% drop from the 1970s to 2010 in populations of birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and fish around the globe. So we're seeing declines kind of across the board. It's not just pollinators, it's other wildlife as well. And we can all play a part in helping these creatures and plants to thrive and to do better. And a lot of our human impacts are what cause declines in many things. And so we can all play a role, whether it be really small or really large. We can all help. And I'm sure that Daniel and Isis will talk a little bit more about that. And that's one of the reasons that we're going out to Ardenwood as well, is to do a little part of our own to help pollinators and other animals. Next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit more about pollinators and their main groups. So as I mentioned, we do have vertebrate and invertebrate pollinators, but I'll talk a little bit more about the main groups of invertebrate pollinators. And if you're not super familiar with what invertebrates are, they're animals that don't have a backbone. And so some of those main groups are butterflies. There's also flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and flies. Sorry, I already said that. But there's also vertebrate pollinators like that hummingbird in the bottom right-hand corner as well. And so in order to maintain a lot of genetic plant diversity, these pollinators that have co-evolved over time with a lot of the plants are really essential to maintain these populations. Next slide. So beetles are really good pollinators, and you'll see them sometimes on flowers. They like to eat flower petals, but they'll also go down and eat some of the pollen, and they'll collect it on their body. They have hairs on their bodies where they can collect pollen, and then they'll just move from one flower to another and kind of pollinate these things as they go. And there's actually a whole group of what's called flower beetles, which like to hang around flowers, and they help pollinate a lot of these plants. And they can come in many shapes and sizes and colors. Actually, beetles are the most diverse group of insects in the world. And some of their most identifiable features are a set of hard wings on their backs, which are called elytra. And so when you're out kind of looking and observing some of these things, that can help you sort of identify beetles. Is if you see those hard casings on the back of them that are wings, that'll kind of help you narrow it down to whether something's a beetle or not. Next slide. There are also flies. There's a whole group of flies which are called flower flies or syrphid flies, or they're also called hover flies. But many different flies also serve the purpose of pollination. And you can kind of identify them by the fact that they have two wings. Bees and wasps have four wings total, so two sets of wings. But flies only have two wings, and they usually don't carry very much pollen. They're usually not very hairy either, and they have really large bulging eyes in the front of their heads, and they also have short and thick antennae. But like I said, many times flies can look a lot like bees. Like, for example, those first two pictures and even the fourth one on the slide, they do resemble bees, right? The first two look a lot like honeybees, and then the fourth one looks a lot like a bumblebee because it's very fuzzy. So it's nice to know some of those features to help distinguish when you're out in the field kind of looking at these things. Next slide. There's also wasps. Wasps are also pollinators, and they're also really good predators of other insects. Some wasps can be parasitoids, and they can parasitize other insects, or they parasitize plants sometimes, but not really to an ill effect. But wasps have four wings that are folded back, and they can look tough and have narrow bodies with slim waists. They also don't carry very much pollen. Most adult wasps are nectaring for the most part, and they're really good hunters, and so they'll hunt for their young. And sometimes you'll see wasps sort of hunting for caterpillars, and you'll see them carrying them, and then they carry them back to their nests where their little larvae are at, and they feed those insects to their young. They're also not very hairy. They don't have very many hairs on their body, which some other insects do. And you can see that their color patterns are actually part of their exoskeletons instead of being colored hairs. Next slide. And then we have probably some of our most important pollinators are native bees. We have nearly 3,600 species of native bees in the US, north of Mexico. And it's somewhere around 5,000 species in North America total. And as I mentioned earlier, here in California, we're really lucky that we have about 1,600 species of native bees. Next slide. And as you can see in this slide, there is a huge diversity in different kinds of bees. They come in all shapes and sizes too, and different color patterns. And they can be fairly large, larger than a quarter, to really small and kind of a couple of millimeters in size. So they really vary greatly. But where we see a huge diversity of bees is kind of dry and arid environments. So a really good example here in California that has a large diversity of native bee species is actually Pinnacles National Park. And they have somewhere around 400 native bee species there. So if you ever go out and check it out, look for some bees. I'm sure you'll find a lot of really cool things out there. But there's several different orders of bees. There's things called digger bees, carpenter bees, cuckoo bees, green sweat bees, bumblebees. So all sorts of different kinds of bees. And it's really, really a fascinating world once you dive into it. Next slide. And where you might see some of these native bees if you're out looking. So we have cavity nesting bees, and sometimes they come out of like old rodent burrows. In the springtime, when you see some of the, if you see native bumblebees, they like to nest in old rodent burrows and things like that. And so sometimes if you see them, you can follow them to their nests, and you'll see that they go into some of those old rodent burrows, and you can kind of follow them around and see that. Or you'll just see them sort of come out of the ground sometimes. There's also ground nesting bees. So a lot of bees will just burrow down into the ground, and they make small nests like tunnels. And most of our native bees are actually ground nesting bees. And then we also have stem and wood nesting bees, which will use old sort of woody plant materials to nest in. A really good example of that is carpenter bees. There are these large black bees that look kind of like a bumblebee, and they like to either sort of make a nest into the wood sidings on your house, or a lot of them will use agave species or yuccas to nest in as well. Next slide. And I wanted to mention honeybees too, because most of us, when we think of pollinators, are really familiar with honeybees and not so much with the other species of bees. But honeybees are not your typical bee, and they're actually not native to the United States. They actually come from Europe, and they're European honeybees. And they're social insects, and most of our native bees are actually solitary insects. They're solitary in nature, where they don't produce these huge colonies like honeybees do. Honeybees also have a caste system, so they have queens and workers and drones, and cooperative care in their hives, and they can produce multiple generations per year. And their colonies are actually perennial too, so they can overwinter by feeding on honey. But honeybees are really they're more managed kind of like livestock in a way, for crop pollination. And sometimes there can be negative implications from honeybees, because they can also be vectors for diseases or parasites into our native bee species colonies, or just into our native bee species hives. Or a lot of them are solitary, so they don't have huge colonies, but they can have negative implications on our native species populations. And I just wanted to mention that so that you're all aware of that as well. Next slide. So there's also butterflies and moths, and we'll talk a little bit more about butterflies since we're focusing a little bit more on monarchs in this presentation. But butterflies and moths are really closely related. They're in the order called Lepidoptera. So they're both very similar, but you can kind of tell them apart sometimes in that butterflies have clubbed antennae, which you can see on the left-hand side of this slide. They have these sort of bulbous tips on their antenna, and they tend to have their wings, they'll put them upright, whereas moths will oftentimes be laying flat. And moths also have straight antennas, but the males sometimes have sort of feathery antennas, because they use those to find females, so they can actually sense pheromones through the clubbed antennas or their feathered antennas. But so the left-hand side is a butterfly, and then the right-hand side is a moth. And So sometimes we think of moths being kind of bland in color, but they can actually be really colorful as well, just like this one in this slide. Next slide. So some butterflies have very specialized habitat needs. Most butterflies as adults are generalists, and they'll use many different food sources. So they'll nectar on many different species of flowers and plants. But some butterflies are actually specialists as caterpillars, and they use a limited number of food or host plants in order to reach adulthood. So it's really important to maintain native plant diversity for a lot of different pollinators, not just butterflies. There's also specialist bees and other pollinators as well. But that's why native plants are so important when we talk about pollinators, because there are certain cases where things are specialists and require a certain species of plant to reproduce or to reach adulthood. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit more about monarch butterflies. Monarchs are pretty unique as well in that they are migratory species of butterfly, and they have large populations that can move thousands of miles in some instances across multiple countries and migrate back in the wintertime and overwinter. And so their caterpillars are some of those specialists that I mentioned. Their larvae are host specific, and so they need milkweed species in order to feed on when they're caterpillars and to reach that adulthood stage. And native milkweeds are really important for them in that native milkweeds have a time in which they're blooming and growing, and then they go dormant in the winter times, and it kind of follows that natural cycle that they need. And there's some species that can be problematic of milkweeds that are not native. There's tropical milkweed, which we see a lot along coastal areas or just in different parts of California that's used a lot. And that one doesn't go dormant in the winter times, and so sometimes those cause issues such as parasites or pests and diseases. There's a protozoan pest that's called Ophriocistis electroscera, or OE for short, which persists on tropical milkweed, so it can be problematic. And that's why native plants, again, are so important. And as adults, monarchs are generalists, so they can kind of feed on any flowers. They just require nectar to fuel their flight. And as I mentioned, they do have overwintering behavior, which is really interesting. It's interesting. And so they go to forested groves to go into what's called diapause. And so it's a period when there's a lot less activity and they're kind of hanging around in an area. And when it's warm enough, they'll go down and get some nectar. But typically they're not reproducing at this point, and they're just kind of hanging out and kind of trying to pass the winter. Next slide. So we have what's called Western monarchs. They're unique in that they stay typically to the western side of the United States. They're the same species that is on the eastern side as well, but they're kind of divided by a geographic barrier, which is the Rocky Mountains. And so the Western monarchs stay to the west of the United States, whereas the eastern population kind of spreads across the eastern side and goes down and overwinters in Mexico. The Western monarchs overwinter along the coast of California. So again, another thing that we're really lucky to have here in California is this a large section of the coast is actually overwintering sites for Western monarchs. Next slide. So adult monarchs overwinter in clusters in protected microhabitats that are provided by the California coastal groves of trees from typically October to March. So you'll see that monarchs start heading back to their overwintering sites sometimes as early as August or September. And you'll see them coming to those overwintering sites in October and kind of staying and hanging around until end of February to March. And then they'll start moving again and migrating eastward and northward. So monarchs stop laying eggs for the wintertime with a few exceptions. If they do have milkweeds in an area and it gets warm enough, then sometimes they will be cued to continue to reproduce. But this can be a problem sometimes. And there are over 400 wintering sites along the California coast, stretching from Mendocino County all the way into Baja California. Next slide. So here you can see along the edge of California, there's all these like blue and orange spots. Those are some of the overwintering sites where you might see clusters of monarchs. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that the forest, those trees look like they're like brown, kind of dying, but those are actually clusters of monarchs as well. And there's so many of them, and this is down in Mexico, in Mexico. There's so many of them that it kind of makes the trees look a different shade of color. It makes them look kind of brown and like they're dying, but it's just a bunch of monarchs that are overwintering there. Next slide. And so for this presentation, I wanted to incorporate a little bit more about how invertebrates are important or significant in the Latino culture. And insects have long been used traditionally in Latin American cultures. Some of these uses have also continued into present day. So invertebrates have been used as a food source. There's also medicinal uses of some invertebrates. There's also industry uses such as natural dyes. And they also have spiritual and cultural connections and beliefs and symbolisms that are tied to invertebrates. And so in this slide, you can see there's a woman holding the pestle on a metate. And she's grinding what's called cochinil, which is an invertebrate species that grows on nopales, on cacti. So if you look at the bottom picture, it's a bunch of cactus pads that have this white stuff that's growing on them. That's all the cochinil. It's a scale insect. And so they harvest that and they dry it and then they grind it down and it produces a really vibrant, like red to pink dye that's used for textiles. Next slide. And insects also have a lot of culinary uses. These are examples that I know from down in Mexico. So a lot of they call them gusanos de maguey or de agave. They're larvae of or caterpillars that grow in the agave plants. And these are actually considered a delicacy. And they're used to make salsas or to eat in tacos or many different ways. Sometimes you also see them at the bottom of a tequila or mezcal bottle. And so there's a lot of use for invertebrates. And as I mentioned earlier, they're actually really high in protein, so they are very nutritious. And in fact, they have more protein than beef or meat does. And so you can see the gusanos de maguey on the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side, there's a taco de chapulines, which are grasshoppers. Next slide. There's also medicinal uses of invertebrates and industry uses, as I mentioned. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see these sort of terracotta or clay pots. And those are actually pots that are used to raise stingless bees. So that's something that's occurred in indigenous cultures of southern Mexico for thousands of years. And they have raised stingless bees to collect honey from, which the honey is supposed to be medicinal and have a lot of medicinal qualities to it. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that this is yarn that was dyed with the cochinil, which I mentioned earlier. So it produces that really vibrant red color. Next slide. And then to tie this back to monarchs, there's a lot of cultural significance of monarchs and symbolisms, particularly in the Mexican culture, but it's representative kind of across a lot of other Latin cultures as well. One of the particular symbolisms is for Day of the Dead, where we believe that monarchs are the souls of loved ones who have passed on. And generally, they return around November 1st and 2nd, which is Dia de Todos los Santos and Dia de los Muertos. And so having these monarchs sort of come back to these areas of Mexico during that time represents the souls of those lost ones that are always coming around the same time that Dia de los Muertos is happening. And so they return to their overwintering sites in the state of Mexico and Michoacan around those days. And so there's a huge culture and reverence around monarchs and their symbolism in that respect. And you can see in this photo that there's a whole sort of parade going on of folks that are dressed as monarchs and also have the painted sort of skeleton faces for a Dia de los Muertos parade in Mexico City. And monarchs have also become a symbol in more recent years of immigration. So they have become a symbol for a lot of Latin American immigrants, not just people of Mexico, but folks from all over Latin America who have immigrated to the U.S. And similarly to monarchs, they migrate across a really long stretch of land that's a treacherous journey, and they face many perils. And so it's easy to identify with something that has a similar journey to you, and so people have related to the monarchs in that sense as well. And so there's a lot of importance of invertebrates in a lot of Latin American cultures, and just wanted to share those with you. And with that, I'll pass it over to Isis.
Hi, everybody. All right, thank you so much, Deedee. That was incredible, and I learned some new things too. So to everyone still watching, I'm going to be taking the next 10, 15 minutes to talk to you all about the actions that you can take to help monarchs and other pollinators in your community and beyond. So we're going to kind of start with a little bit of a doom and gloom, which is their population status. But then we're going to dive right into conservation efforts, ways to get involved, action steps, and really fun projects that are happening right now. Okay, so Western monarchs are, as Deedee mentioned, in peril, and their population has been, well, the species overall, both Western and Eastern monarchs have been in decline for several decades now, but especially those Western monarchs that are breeding, migrating, and overwintering west of the Rocky Mountains. The Western monarchs are experiencing a even larger decline than Eastern monarchs. And so we are asking you, we're inviting you to get involved in whatever way that you can to help support monarchs, their epic migration, to help support the natural habitats that they rely on. And yeah, so I'll go over a couple steps we can take in the next few slides, but I also recommend checking out savewesternmonarchs.org if you'd like to learn more. We got a banner up. So again, that's savewesternmonarchs.org. And that's a great just one-stop resource. And it'll walk you through 5 key action steps that you can take to get involved today. Okay, so as I hinted at, if we look at a graph showing the population over the past 4 decades or so, we can see that there were millions of monarchs in the 1980s, whereas today monarch populations are bouncing around in the thousands in the West. And that's just, it's a long-term decline. We had some great news last year when we saw more monarchs coming back to our Western overwintering sites, but it still represents a really, really large decline over time. And so we need to celebrate the small wins while also working towards the end goal of monarch abundance, like we saw several decades ago. And there are no quick fixes to solve all these large and complex forces that are causing the declines, but we all can take actions, big and small, in many different communities to help save Western monarchs and protect other at-risk pollinators, butterflies, bee species that need our help. So Deedee went over some of the monarch biology and ecology, so I won't reiterate any of that, but I will say that monarchs are currently considered a candidate species under the United States Endangered Species Act. And there was a little confusion earlier this year when the IUCN Red List categorized monarchs as endangered. And what that did was it raised a lot of incredible awareness, and we're getting more and more funding and more attention on this conservation issue. And so more people are wanting to help, which is really, really incredible. But I do want to clarify that the IUCN Red List categorization of monarchs as endangered does not give them the legal protections that listing under the Endangered Species Act would. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to make an official listing decision on monarchs in fiscal year 2024, which actually happens to be the end of next year. So the end of 2023, we should hear if monarchs are going to be listed as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. But no matter what their listing status is, we can all take action and get involved, and they still need our help. So I think one place to start is understanding the primary threats. So what are causing these issues and what's harming monarchs in our environments? And so to quickly go over them, the primary problems are habitat loss. So of both the breeding, so milkweed and nectar habitat, so the migratory and breeding habitat, and then also the overwintering habitat, which Deedee touched on later on in their presentation. And so some of that is being developed or logged or transitioning into different landscape uses that no longer serve monarchs. So an important solution for that is to be aware of which habitats monarchs utilize and then protect those. And we can even work on restoring those in communities that once hosted monarchs, but no longer do. Another threat is pesticide use, so herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. And so we want to work towards minimizing our reliance on pesticides and reducing the harm or the risks associated with exposure to pesticides. So if we could limit the exposure that monarchs get to pesticides, that will really help. And then also climate change, including increased drought severity and frequency, some of the wildfires, and then some of the biological cues are like when the native milkweed plants are emerging in the spring, the timing is shifting for when our plants are emerging and when monarchs are getting their cues to leave their overwintering sites. So we want to make sure that we're providing habitat and that we're working towards these long-term goals to preserve the seasons and support these natural cycles that occur each year. Okay, and so this brings us to where we're at and what I want to talk about for the rest of this. So how do we bring back the monarchs? And this is a picture taken on Saturday, actually, at the Pacific Grove Butterfly Sanctuary down in Monterey County. And so you can see here that our efforts are working. So I talked about some problems and some threats, but I want to give you hope because we can do things that have great impact, and we're seeing monarchs bounce back a little bit. And so hopefully if we continue these efforts, we can see even greater increases in their population over time. But it's going to be an all hands on deck effort. Okay, and one of the cool things about protecting and conserving monarchs is that they're a flagship species, which means that our efforts to help monarch butterflies oftentimes benefit many other pollinators, such as bees and flies and wasps and all those great invertebrates that Deedee mentioned and kind of went into in their presentation earlier. So if you help monarchs because you love monarchs, you can you can feel good about yourself because you're also helping all these other pollinators too. Okay, so here's some solutions. We can protect and restore overwintering habitat. We can protect and restore breeding and migratory habitat. We can reduce the risk from pesticide exposure. We can participate in community science, and we can advocate for monarchs and other insects. So I'll go over each of these, and I just want to reiterate that point that everyone's actions can make a difference. So in 2020, we had less than 2,000 monarch butterflies reported at overwintering sites in the West. Less than 2,000 across the entire state. Many of the groves were empty. And then last year in 2021, 2022, so that winter, fall winter, our community science volunteers sent in reports, and we tallied it up, and we saw that there were nearly 250,000 butterflies. So in the course of one season or 1 year, monarchs went from less than 2,000 butterflies overwintering along the coast to nearly 250,000 butterflies. And there's a lot of big questions about why that happened and what sort of relationships the Eastern monarchs have with the Western monarchs, and are there places we don't know monarchs are visiting, and are the plants we're planting in our gardens really helping, and maybe monarchs had a really great summer and bred a lot and produced a lot of caterpillars that are now adults. So I think the answer is probably a combination of all these factors. And we're going to have to wait a couple more years to put this uptick into context. But I'll share a little piece of news that isn't super widely known just yet. But as of today, there are over 60,000 monarch butterflies observed in the West across 35 sites. And so that only represents about 11% of the overwintering sites that our volunteers will be monitoring in the next 2 months or next 3 months. And so if we already have 60,000 butterflies this year, it's looking like this fall and winter season is going to be another good year for overwintering monarchs. Okay, so protecting and restoring overwintering habitat. I just wanted to share a couple pictures to inspire you all. So even though overwintering habitat has been lost in the past, a lot of times due to ignorance, like people just don't know that the habitat benefits monarchs, or if monarchs aren't there for 3 out of the 4 seasons, it might be easy to cut a couple limbs of a tree or take one tree down. But then in winter, when the monarchs return, they might not have their overwintering habitat. So it's really incredible when land managers get out there and they begin stewarding the land and really creating projects that'll help monarchs and their habitat in the long run. So you can see on the left, there's some folks who are planting a new succession of trees to hopefully grow into overwintering monarch trees in the next couple decades. And then the second thing we can do is protect and restore breeding and migratory habitat. And so one of the ways we can do that is by planting native milkweeds and nectar resources. So here in this picture, you can see a monarch flying over the milkweed plant, which again is the host plant of the monarch butterfly. So they'll only lay their eggs on the milkweed, and the caterpillars will eat the milkweed. And so you could start there. You could start by looking for native milkweed species. And a great website to check out is Calscape and Calflora. So if you Google those two websites, Calscape and Calflora, will help you find native milkweed species for your area. And you can go find them at a native plant nursery near you. And a lot of times, those will also be grown without pesticides, which is a really important thing to be aware of when you're deciding to install monarch habitat or pollinator habitat. You're going to want to buy what we call bee-safe plants. So one recommendation is to seek out organic plants and seeds. And again, your local native plant nurseries will likely carry many options for you, so we highly recommend that. And big box stores like Lowe's, it's a lot trickier to find plants that haven't been treated with pesticides. So yeah, if you can support your small local native plant nurseries, that would be incredible. And you'll probably have a better chance of finding bee-safe plants there. And thanks, we have the banner for calscape.org and calflora.org to help you find native milkweed and nectar plants near you. So another way to buy bee-safe plants or plant them is to ask your nurseries if they are using neonicotinoids, which is a type of pesticide, and other systemic insecticides. And so just start a dialogue with whoever you're buying your plants from, and just make sure and double check that they're not treated. And if they are, then all you have to say is, okay, it'd be really awesome if yeah, or you could just let them know that you're interested in purchasing a pesticide-free plant. It's actually kind of interesting because a couple research studies have shown that even our plants that are marked pollinator friendly are sometimes contaminated with different pesticides too. And this stems from a desire to create that perfect plant with no damage. It looks really pretty on the shelf, so people will buy it, right? But if you express interest in buying these bee-safe pollinator, like truly pollinator-friendly plants, that would be incredible, and we can start to shift the dialogue there. Okay, and then participate in community science. So community science is scientific work that is undertaken by members of the general public. So you could participate if you'd like. And it's often done in collaboration with or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions or organizations. So our org, Xerces, has several community science projects that you could participate in. And participation could look like taking photos on your phone and submitting them to the iNaturalist app. That might take just a couple minutes. Or other projects might ask you to undergo training so that you can develop the skills that you need to collect special and important data for certain research questions. And so you really have there's a wealth of projects out there that you can choose from. So think about maybe if you have a few extra hours here and there, and what species really excite you. And there's probably a community science project out there that you could participate in. So one of the projects I'd like to mention is the Western Monarch Count. So you can visit westernmonarchcount.org and learn how to count butterflies. So if you would like to participate in the effort to count overwintering monarchs in the West, you can visit westernmonarchcount.org. And you can also go to our events page and check out training events or group counts or public tour days if you'd like to go see overwintering monarchs. There's also another project for the spring, summer, and early fall. So if you see monarch butterflies flying around your garden, nectaring on some of the flowering bushes, then you can take a picture and submit that to Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper website, or you can join our project on iNaturalist and submit it there. And all your submissions to the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper will also benefit other projects like the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge in the spring and the International Monarch Monitoring Blitz in the summer, which is when Canada or community scientists from Canada, the United States, and Mexico all work together to gather data on monarchs and milkweed in the West. Okay, and then the last thing you can do is advocate for monarchs and other insects. So here is an image of some lovely folks who signed up for Xerces habitat kits. So they're out there installing habitat, monarch habitat and pollinator habitat in their communities. They're engaging visitors and their friends and family and sharing it out. And yeah, it all makes a difference. And so we're just really grateful for the great community out there who's taken action, getting involved. And it's also really fun. I feel like we're all becoming friends too, working towards a common goal. So I just wanted to end with a couple photos from this past weekend. So here's a photo of Pacific monarchs in Pacific Grove from Saturday. Here's some monarchs clustering at Natural Bridges State Park on Saturday. So that's in Santa Cruz, if you'd like to go visit it. And then we have monarchs at the San Leandro Golf Course. So this photo was taken on Sunday. And the San Leandro Golf Course is out in our Bay Area region. And so if you would like to see these monarchs yourself, we do have a public tour happening on Saturday, November 19th at 11 a.m. And so we can send out some links to register for that. I think it's in the chat. So you can go to the chat and register for this event to see the monarchs at the San Leandro Golf Course. There's over 1,000 butterflies there. It's really incredible to see. All right, I'll pass it off to Daniel now.
Great. Thank you, Isis, for that awesome presentation about monarchs. And thank you, Deedee, for giving such a great in-depth explanation about pollinators. Such a great topic, and it's always great to learn about it. So I'm just going to switch it up a little bit here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what kind of projects have been going on in the East Bay. But first, like I mentioned, my name is Daniel Correa with Latino Outdoors. So a lot of my stuff involves more like community work and trying to kind of mix community work and conservation work. So next slide. Great. So here we have a nice map because everybody loves a map that can show a lot of areas. So I'm sure folks from the San Francisco Bay Area may understand this map. But for the folks that may not know what you are looking at here, so if you look towards your southwest, San Francisco, San Francisco is going to be right there, right next to the ocean. West of it is what we call the East Bay. That's the area where I focus most of my outings and a lot of my work. Right above the East Bay is the Delta area. So this is a very special area for both habitat and biological species. This is an area where the San Joaquin River and Sacramento River meet, and they go out into what we call the San Francisco Bay Area. And then from there, it drains into the ocean. So it goes underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. And then right up north from the East Bay is Sacramento. So here we have a couple of spots where I've highlighted a couple of areas where pollinator habitat has been done. A lot of these are in both private property, public parks, even East Bay Regional Parks areas. And, when it comes to pollinator restoration, like Deedee and Isis have put out there, is that, it's a community work project. We need to ensure that pollinators and monarchs are saved. And even though, humans are the cause of a lot of the destruction of the areas of pollinators, there is hope of, like Isis mentioned, is to put more of the restoration work into it. So these are a few project areas where we've been doing, or at least where I've been working with, and I've been part of volunteer work. So next slide. So right here, so for the Richmond Greenway is this awesome long park that used to be a railroad track. It is located between Unity Park and 8th and 9th Street. And this is a very long area where people from the community of Richmond and other nonprofit organizations, and then also the city, has been able to take or adopt various sections of this area, and they planted a lot of great native plants and a lot of food plants out there. And one of the great things that every time I go out there to Richmond Greenway is that I see a lot of pollinators, bees, beetles, monarchs even. So this area has become a really good hub within the Richmond area, which, by the way, is a huge urban area right next to the Bay Area, to the Bay Area. It's right next to Oakland, so you can kind of imagine how urban this area can be with a bunch of houses with not a lot of green areas. So this space in the Greenway is a great area for to enhance the just the passing of a lot of the monarchs and a lot of the pollinators that go around. And then the other picture as well, it's the Alhambra Native Plant Trail. So this one's a really nice one because this one was developed by some of the Friends of Alhambra Creek out in Martinez, which is located in the Bay Area and the East Bay as well. And basically, this is like a bunch of little gardens throughout the downtown area of Martinez. It is a small little city. Oh, not even a city, it's just a little town in there. But a lot of the volunteers around there have been able to enhance these corners with, planting milkweeds, planting asters, and planting other native plants that both the monarchs and the pollinators, benefit from, between laying eggs, getting energy to get through the day, and just being able to stop and rest in those areas. Next slide. And then we have other community work. So the picture at the Gloria Glow Community Garden, those are a bunch of volunteers actually installing Xerces kids. So I'm going to give a little shout out to the Xerces kids that Isis mentioned at the end of her presentation. They are awesome. This year, we've been able to, each kid came with 85 plants, all of them native. Milkweeds was involved. And as long as, asters as well, some gum plants. So a lot of great native plants that a lot of pollinators, a lot of other insects love. And right here, we can see a lot of volunteers working in front of that garden to plant those kids. They were prepping that site for the planting by removing hard soils, putting some wood chips down, and just making a great place for those plants to grow. And then hopefully by either next year, we'll have a lot of plants coming up. The rains here in the San Francisco Bay Area are happening, so we're very hopeful that all of these plants are going to be very healthy. And then for the next one is Point Pinole. So this one's a really great area because it is one of the monarch hibernation areas and the resting area. So, and this is actually one of our trips in November. On November 20th, we're going to go down to Point Pinole, East Bay Regional Parks. And what makes this area great is that the East Bay Regional Parks has developed a nice little pollinator garden right by one of their parking lots at the entrance of their trails, and it provides a lot of habitat. They put a lot of work into it, and you can kind of see how great the plants have been coming up, and you can have a variety of plants there. So let's go to the next slide. And yeah, so those are going to be my slides, and I would like to thank everybody. I don't know if everybody wants to just do a little closeout as well, because
Oh, I think your audio might have cut out, Daniel, but yeah, no, thank you all so much for facilitating this wonderful discussion and providing all of that information for everyone. I know that I learned a lot, and I really am feeling inspired to want to give my little part in the stewardship and restoration work that I know I can do to help the pollinators and the monarchs and all of these wonderful insects that give so much to us as humans. So thank you all so much. Yeah, if anyone anyone that's still watching us live, if you all have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat so that we can review some of the things that we discussed today, or if you're wanting a little bit of extra information about anything, we can help drop some links in the chat or just reiterate some of the things that we discussed today?
While we wait, we could talk a little bit about some of the activities we'll do.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, for anyone that's just joining us now, this is the first part of our 3-part pollinator conservation series with Xerces. We also are working with East Bay Regional Parks District to facilitate 2 in-person outings in the upcoming weeks. So we have an outing this Saturday at Ardenwood Farm. There is still some space available, so please visit our website at latino.outdoors.org to find the registration links to those events. And then we have another in-person outing on Sunday, November 20th at Point Pinole. That is one of the photos that Daniel showed in his presentation as well. And we have spots available for those. And all of these events are family friendly. They are going to include a couple different sorts of activities, some planting, some observations, some fun activities with arts and crafts. So just a lot of ways to get involved and participate. And so we definitely want to encourage you all to join us and RSVP and make a little difference in the pollinator conservation.
Thank you. I think one of the exciting things too is if you've ever wanted to get up close and personal with a bee or a bug but not have to touch it, we're going to be using butterfly nets, and Deedee is going to lead us through a pollinator activity where we will be surveying the nectar plants at some of these sites to see what species are out there. And so we'll be able to look at them really closely, and we'll put them in a little vial so that you can actually hold them. So whether you're comfortable with bees and butterflies and beetles or not, you'll be able to safely look at them up close and learn about them. And we'll get to see the diversity of pollinators at some of these restoration projects that Daniel mentioned. And so you can see firsthand the impacts of people's actions. And it's also really cool. Like when you look at bugs up close, they're really beautiful, I think. I guess I'm biased, but yeah, it's I hope it's going to be a really fun time on both of these events, and we'll do a couple different activities, but yeah. And we're going to give away prizes at Point Pinole too. We'll be doing a little like scavenger hunt activity. So yeah, we're really excited. So you might walk away with some pollinator goodies as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and those 2 events will be perfect opportunities for folks to ask questions in person. If there's something that maybe comes to mind from the presentation today that maybe you don't ask today, or maybe you think of it later on, you can always ask at the in-person event, and we'd be happy to provide more information and provide other information that maybe we weren't able or didn't have enough time to cover in these presentations as well. So definitely great learning opportunities, and we'll provide some resources too where you can kind of look at some of the information and learn more about different pollinators and see some of the resources or references that we use to learn more about these things. And not just pollinators, but some of the plants too. I have tons of books, so I'll be taking field guides out for you guys to look at. You can leaf through them, you can look at them, read them while you're there, and hopefully learn some more. And like I said, we're always welcome to answer questions for you and provide more information.
And I think these trips also gives an opportunity for people to go to these parks as well that they may not have known they're around there. So, we like to promote different natural areas and open spaces. And the best thing is that, most of these places, the parking, there's a fee for it, but we were able to get them for free. And just so if you want to get out for the day and you want to explore a new park, definitely come check out our little outings on the 12th and the 20th.
Awesome. Thank you all. I'm not seeing very many questions come in, but just a lot of thank yous to our great panelists and people that are looking forward to joining in our in-person events. So we'll conclude our presentation here, and definitely check us out, latinooutdoors.org, to RSVP for our upcoming events. Check out Xerces to learn more about all the wonderful work that they're doing. And I also put in a bunch of links in the chat in there so you can revisit the iNaturalist app, the Save the Western Monarchs.org, to learn about different resources and ways that you can get involved. So thank you all again so much to our wonderful panelists for all your knowledge, and thank you all to our viewers for tuning in. I hope that you all have a great rest of your night or wherever you're at in the world. Thank you all so much, and take care. See you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.